views expressed in this podcast are the speaker's own and are not the views of This Week in FinTech or any other person or entity. The content provided in this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal, business, tax, or investment advice or a recommendation, solicitation, endorsement, or offering by me or anyone else for the sale, subscription, or purchase of securities or for investment advisory services of any kind.
Thank you for joining us, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in FinTech's podcast. I'm very excited about this conversation today. I'm sitting here with Eli Wachs, who is the co-founder and CEO of Footprint. We met for the first time, I want to say a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, at a This Week in FinTech event during New York FinTech Week over on the rooftop of Somewhere Nowhere. But I've been watching Eli and watching Footprint online as their Twitter footprint in the FinTech ecosystem has grown. Eli got in touch recently because they just had a spate of new product launches. And I was curious to dive in a little bit more and understand Footprint as a business and where they sit in the quickly growing KYB and KYC ecosystem. So Eli, thanks so much for joining us.
Nick, appreciate you having me. This may be the most successful follow-up for someone I've met at Somewhere Nowhere. So this is very exciting for me.
Most successful so far. I'm sure there'll be a lot of good client pitches there in the future, though. I was wondering if you could just give us kind of a quick intro to yourself before we dive in.
Yeah, my name's Eli. I grew up in Philadelphia. I've been starting companies for longer than I'd like to admit. But I started my first company in high school after reading someone's book and sending them a cold email. Went to Stanford, started another company there. I was in the flu tracking space to try to prevent pandemics. So if you're looking for niche people to blame COVID on, you can blame my lack of fortitude. And I got really interested in privacy and data, and that took me down the long road of starting Footprint.
We'll get to this a little bit later on in the conversation, but I feel like there's not a lot of founders that take a truly academic approach to problem solving. And that does seem like something that stands out particularly about you. But getting into Footprint to start with, what is Footprint? What do you do as a company? What problems do you solve?
Footprint's building the identity infrastructure for the internet, which is jargon. We like to say we're building end-to-end onboarding, embedded onboarding. Once again, fairly jargony, but maybe a bit closer. But what does that product actually do? To us, we give people what used to be several different point solutions. So if you're onboarding a user, you need to build out the UX to collect information. You then need ways to verify it, both from a SIP perspective, so is this user in a database, a fraud perspective, just because they're in a database, should they be in the database, and do they act like the owner of the information in that database? Then you need a way to store that information, so how do you vault it? And then how do you re-authenticate that user when they come back, so sign in? And lastly, you've onboarded someone, you've paid money to verify them, presumably you have some high value action that you'd like to do with them after that, so you'll probably want to link their bank account or let them link a credit card. We help you do that as well. This is all getting to our vision of building portable identity. Another fun buzzword, but to us, that essentially means changing the math equation of fraud. So instead of looking for every last fraudster, something that Footprint's never going to do, sorry to our investors, that none of our competitors are going to do, sorry to their investors, but it's doing the more mathematically feasible approach, which is creating a centralized database of good actors. So that's what we do today, and that's what we're on a mission to do.
The space that you're operating in, you started Footprint almost 4 years ago now, January 2022, or that's the official start date that I'm seeing, but I'm sure that the genesis of Footprint was well before that, and that's just kind of the official start the clock date. Since 2022, since 2021, the online financial services ecosystem has grown in scale. It's funny you talk about, COVID. It feels like there is a big migration to online and digital payments coming out of COVID, because there is a little bit of a hesitation around physical contact with payment methods. And so all of a sudden, digital payments exploded. As digital payments explode, new fraud vectors are created, new opportunities to use LLMs or spoofing or phishing to collect online and digital payment information. And so on both sides of the transaction, merchant and customer, it's so much more important to understand who you're dealing with. And so there's also been this resulting explosion in KYC tooling, whether it's orchestration or data provision. But what you do at Footprint sounds like it's actually genuinely different from a lot of other tools you see in the market. And we'll get into some of the newer product launches, the bank linking, the rules engine that you recently launched. But I'm curious about the space that you've carved out in the market, especially because I think you mentioned it was initially a product that was really focused on financial health and access. Is that right?
So a couple of things. You hit on a bunch of great points. Liminal recently put out a report of their survey of the 191 vendors across KYC and KYB. This is a disgustingly large field. I'm very honored as Footprint was in the top 27. So we rang the gong in the office for being in the top 27 quadrant. To clarify, this isn't me saying we were 27. They don't assign a numerical. They just have a quadrant. But yes, and I think we saw over COVID, fraud became a lot more sophisticated. This went from picture a Hollywood movie with some hacker in their parents' basement to now, if you go to the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia, you have multi-hundred person operations. There are corporates essentially that have a bottom line and they have shareholders in a way. And they have labor, which is a pretty interesting type of labor. But they're doing very sophisticated fraud. You're seeing much longer payoff times for them in pig butchering. And the final thing you bring up there with AI is investors like to ask their portcos, what are they doing with AI? Because their LPs like to ask them what their portcos are doing with AI. And I do think there are interesting things in AI for footprinting companies in our space, fairly limited to manual review, which isn't actually catching bad actors. It's helping ops folks become more efficient. For using AI, fraudsters have a great use case. You can now create much more believable generated driver's licenses or passports. You can more quickly spin up synthetic identities to then nurture. So it's leveled the playing field in a bad way, where AI is an amazing tool for fraudsters. It's not really a great tool for companies in it that are essentially solving it in a historic way. And I think that brings to your point of Footprint's unique approach. We looked at the other 190 vendors and we said, clearly, despite these companies raising a lot of money, and it's not that they're nefarious, I think they're doing a noble attempt, but the traditional way of doing this wasn't working, which was essentially collect information, see if that information exists, approve a user. To us, that was an unsolvable math problem. There's an infinite amount of fake identities in the world. We're never going to catch them. There's kind of an infinite amount of identities you can try to put through your device. So when Footprint does verifications, we think about it in a different mathematical way. We think about the P&L of a fraudster. For example, we use similar technology to Spotify and Netflix to essentially count how many identities are on your device. You should probably have one identity on your device. There are worlds where you may have two, maybe partners share a phone, siblings share a phone. There are reasons that we've seen where contextually there should even be 10. A tenant screening company is showing an apartment and a bunch of people are signing up on the same iPad. These are very contextual. In general, though, you shouldn't have more than one. And what Footprint's done very uniquely is we've leveraged the fact that we're the only vaulting company in this space. And we've leveraged a very unique way of doing device fingerprinting and binding. We're a security company and an auth company, which sounds super strange. But just what that lets us do is essentially build our own duplicate database. So when you speak to companies that use Footprint, they'll maybe give a weird answer, which is that their first API calls to the Footprint database, not to LexisNexis or GBG or Ideology or Experian. Is it interesting? Has Footprint seen any of this information associated before in this device? To us, that's what's very powerful. By giving this SDK that lives on the front end, we're able to do that. Let me pause there because that was a mouthful. I get fired up to nerd out on this stuff.
No, those are the best kind of conversations. I feel like one of the big differences from what I'm hearing, if I'm hearing it correctly, is that when I look at a lot of other providers in KYC or KYB or identity space, really the emphasis of the platform is on reducing false positives, finding fraudsters and being able to catch them effectively. Footprint sounds like it takes a different orientation, which is eliminating false negatives, being able to say, we're actually just focused on proving what the people who do exist actually look like. And so we can repeatedly provide some certification that either that corporate or that individual is a real person who's a valid customer for this product. Is that kind of on point or a little bit off?
I think it's on point. The thing that I'll make sure we say is we're not just going to let everybody in. But exactly your point, we actually are willing to go lower margin to increase the fidelity of verifications. To us, the baseline job should be find bad actors. And that's kind of easy to do. Just if you look at the stats of the percent of applicants, you normally find 2% of people are synthetic, maybe 5% are running fake identities. So that should be the baseline job of any company, but it's not scalable. I think when you look at then the evolving landscape of portability, though, where the nuance becomes as you speak, just in today, if you compare rules engines or flows, you'll maybe have company A and they have a SIP where their bank wants them to run people through LexisNexis and they want them to do a driver's license check. And you'll have bank B, which wants them to run people through, let's say, Experian, and they want them to also do a doc step up and a motor vehicle check. So essentially ping the DMV and say that you issue this license. In the other systems of portability that you see out there, they're much more rigid. So they run you through Lexis and they don't collect the license, and then that's the portable identity. Which means that when you show up at company B, your portable identity is worthless because they don't actually have the ability to, in real time, apply that to a new SIP. This leads to the continuous problem that we see today, which has led to $30 billion of identity theft, a number that goes up every year. We're all 191 of us are failing the internet. And I don't take that lightly. There are real ramifications of this. It's very silly for us to create an internet and celebrate how we grow the GDP of it if a growing percentage of that's also fraud, given that this isn't finding Planck's constant. Banks in person have figured out when people walk into branches, they've done a pretty good job of making sure these are real people. We should be able to do that digitally. We've done that for a lot of other areas. And I think that's what Footprint thinks about here, which is different places will have different risk thresholds. So let's build an SDK that gives them toggles around all of these things today and then track that user over time. Because company A has done a lot of the hard work in that they are maybe giving a fraud feedback label. Consortiums historically have a really difficult game theory advantage. Uber probably doesn't want Lyft to know who they offboarded. And I think what we've built from an infrastructure standpoint is essentially we've realized that by giving what we call identity networks to customers that are very dynamic, there's often much more upside in FIS being able to onboard a user to a bank and making it much easier for that person to then get a loan from the same bank because they have their information, then there is risk of them going to a Fiserv bank. And I think that's what we've seen, and that's really what we tried to power.
So you keep mentioning Footprint building out an identity network, and that is a broader and maybe more world-changing vision, I think, than building out a KYC or KYB point solution. And I think it's something meaningful that shows that there is kind of a grander vision here beyond just, one-time verifying identity in order to consummate a specific transaction. It sounds like Footprint's long-term vision is really being an embeddable layer that can plug in relevant identity information for any kind of interaction online. Doesn't even need to necessarily in the future be a financial transaction. To you, what does the world's best identity network actually look like at scale?
I think it's well said. One of the other things we've seen post-COVID is fraudsters have entered other areas. They've said, why stop at a bank when we could get a car or when we can squat in an apartment for a year? And we've definitely seen that evolution. And if you look at other countries around the world, they've broadly figured this out. And it's a broad range, Denmark to India. So it is Scandinavia to South Asia, where those countries have taken the same holy trinity that Footprint has, which is identity, security, and authentication. You need to securely store this information. You need to have a way to relink that user, and you need to make sure you have the identity to begin with. And you're exactly right. That's what we want to do. Now, as I tell our investors, I tell our sales team all the time, none of our early customers use us for identity networks. They use us because they thought we'd built a better point solution. I think sometimes we maybe get lost in overnight successes that companies start with the end goal, but that's not really how you get there because you need to be providing value to our customers. And sometimes that's not the sexiest way. Sometimes it's building 15% better manual review and 10% better dynamic doc step-ups and 5% better name simulations for Hispanic surnames to make sure you're entering the right name into the bureau. Sometimes it's that, and that stacks, and then you're able to do it. But we are building exactly what you described, which is we think that the country in the world deserves a dynamic, embeddable identity layer, which is actually portable and protects people by default.
Well, I think it's a sign of a good product that the value proposition to your end user continues to grow over time. It's a reason that I really don't like early stage investors who focus and overfit for a total addressable market, because my feeling is always, if you back a really good product team, they're just going to grow into bigger and bigger markets. And if you think about some of the most successful companies in the world, they kind of follow this fact pattern. You have Meta, formerly Facebook, which, if you were only concerned with building a social network for college kids, would it look that world changing? But now it's basically the world's largest communications network. But you grow through these sequential steps. Even Stripe, who, I think is very relevant and germane to this conversation, started as a hosted checkout, but now, as you mentioned and alluded to, their goal is to grow the GDP of the internet. Though maybe we should put a little asterisk next to that catchphrase and say Footprint is really hoping to grow the true GDP of the actually valid internet of real users and real people. I'd be curious to hear, from the customer's perspective, how do your users think about what they're using Footprint for and what they're getting from you? There's a lot of different pieces of the product ecosystem. Onboarding, fraud detection, document scanning, and most recently, bank linking and a decision engine that you released. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the different use cases and the new products and why you chose to launch them.
I think for value prop, at the end of the day, we try to make this empirical. So we say we're boosting conversion and compliance, 2 C's, we're reducing fraud and friction, 2 F's. We probably should do a catchier acronym around this. It's actually, that's been my email signature for, I think, 2 years, and I forgot it. And a friend texted me that the other day, and I said, that's great copy. I'm going to add that to our website. How do you think of it? And he said, it's genuinely your email signature. So that's what we think about. And I think that makes sense in that I think there can be a lack of empathy sometimes in sales cycles where you can get frustrated thinking, oh, we're better at this. Why won't this person help me? At the end of the day, we're selling to risk leaders and product leaders who are getting evaluated on pretty specific OKRs. So if you're not tailoring your solution to help them hit their metrics, you're not really building a solution for your buyer. You're building a solution for a vacuum, which may make sense for product hunt, but that's not what's going to actually get bought. How that looks, I'll maybe break those down individually. From a conversion perspective, something that we caught on to pretty early in Footprint was that we saw a lot of companies struggle with conversion with the proper tools that were configured incorrectly. What do I mean by that? If you have a single letter surname, you have to go to LexisNexis first. So we would see a lot of companies set up orchestration flows in other companies where they would have to pay for each vendor they chose, and they would just have the default flows Experian ideology. So that's an example of a silly thing in that you shouldn't need to then go and integrate a third vendor for just that specific edge case. The thing is, KYC is littered with edge cases. You need to make sure that you're collecting an address that doesn't have a PO box. We want to make sure that's included. I said earlier, Hispanic surnames are often result in name mismatches on driver's licenses because vendors may be expecting different surnames listed than what you expect. Footprint was built to essentially simulate a lot of this. So when you go and set up Footprint, you don't need to integrate 3 different bureaus and then write rules based off the dynamicism of each user that you see inputted. We're automatically doing that for you. When we talk about compliance, what I think is really nice is Footprint essentially is a dual view. Oftentimes there's been this struggle of, do we make an onboarding engine where it's very clear to regulators what's happening? Or do we make an onboarding engine where it's very clear to a risk manager or a product leader what rules they're writing? And we said, why can't the answer be both? And maybe to further explain what that looks like today, you'll see some companies that are on tools where they write rules and it just says address mismatch. And they have no idea which vendor said there was an address mismatch. They have no idea understanding how do they determine that. On the other side, you'll see companies where you will get 60 risk signals that are very specific, numbers that make no human sense, and they don't know what to do with it. They say, I have 75 tags. I don't even know how to sort them. This doesn't even seem like it's written in English. Footprint now, you write rules in very simple English. And then we will show you the risk signals. If you click into it, we'll show the underlying vendor and we'll give you a description explaining what does this risk signal actually mean. We'll normalize across all data vendors. And then we create a dual view for your partner banks, for your payments providers, for regulators, which will actually then show those specific numerical codes from the underlying vendors. So that's how we think about compliance. Fraud, oftentimes the struggle is fraudsters don't wait for you. As any company can tell you, fraud is not a spread out cost. They normally get hit 1, 2, 3 times a year. And you want to act very quickly. What I think is very unique about Footprint is we've built a single SDK. And what we mean by that is instead of you needing to go and integrate each vendor that you want to add, Footprint comes pre-integrated. If you're getting hit with a synthetic fraud attack, you can toggle on Centrelink and Footprint, and we'll automatically generate the rules that we think you should be using and apply that for every verification. Push that production in minutes. If you're getting hit with a bot attack or a fraud rig, you can toggle on behavioral fraud with our vendors. And same thing, in minutes, we'll apply that to you. So Footprint's built, our new rules engine lets our customers in real time push to production these different fraud tools. And at the same time, whenever we integrate one, we push that as a software update. We don't think, once again, that you should need to integrate the tools into your system. We believe that we should integrate it to work with every other tool. And I think that's always been the toggle of how opinionated do you want to be? And our answer has essentially been, we will continue to pick the tools that we think work well, but we're going to integrate them to work together. Because even if you pick the right tools, if they're not integrated to work together, you're not going to have that proper toggle of fraud and friction.
So the underlying solutions through your ecosystem or vendor network that you talk about being able to integrate into the decision flow, is Footprint kind of acting as the user there, or signing up with a master account, or are you just making it really easy for your customers to bring those products into the experience by helping them go through onboarding with the underlying vendors quickly?
It's a key differentiator. We are the master vendor. So you don't have to contract with each of our sub vendors. We've built Footprint so that you just get access to those modules.
That's great. So you actually can be proactive there, because you can say, based on our monitoring of your account, we understand that you're currently going through this fraud instance, and we know which underlying vendor is going to help you address this really quickly. And we're going to act as a master account. So we can actually just, through 2 clicks, start onboarding with them and get them to provide data or put a stop hold on payments or whatever it else is.
Exactly. We had a customer who recently their average age of applicant went down by about 3 years, which may sound insignificant, but it was going from maybe 28 to 25. So it is significant because that's an age where you're moving a lot. And we just changed the order of vendors in their waterfall for them. And overnight, they saw a pretty good boost of conversion. I think the nice thing what we do is by using Footprint, you're contracted for all these tools, but you also get this dynamic interface.
We had this very cringy word for it at Google, but I thought it captured it well, the auto magical experience, where you are creating automations for people that they're really not used to having. And it's just wonderful when they actually sign into their dashboard and see that the product experience is actually doing things that they wouldn't have thought to do themselves. You mentioned a few different use cases: buying a car, getting a new bank account, big ticket purchase. I'm kind of curious, what does the distribution of different types of customers look like? And do you have kind of specific profiles that you think about as your customer personas?
It's a pretty wide distribution. I think going earlier, we think fraud is fraud. With that said, I really like going to risk conferences, and that you once again hear people, when you speak to buyers, they don't say fraud is fraud. They say, for us, fraud is referral bonus abuse. Or for us, fraud is ACH disputes. So I think it's very important to know what that is contextually for customers, but we thought it was important to go horizontal pretty early on. So you're right, we see companies, whether it's in lending, like Loan Pro, use Footprint to act as the front end for pretty dynamic loan applications, where we can even render in real time dynamic amounts and terms on our front end. And that goes to the idea of Footprint from day one was built to be that hosted onboarding flow. So you then see working with companies such as FIS for document scanning and verifying licenses when people are opening bank accounts, all the way to FlexCard for car rental or Findigs for apartment rental. So it really does cover that surface area, which I think is important. In terms of persona, at the beginning of the company, we saw an interesting, it's not a bell curve, it's my econometrics professors will be mad at me because I can't identify it, but we would see this weird thing where Series A, Series B companies would love Footprint, Series B and E companies wouldn't like Footprint. And I really thought public companies liked Footprint. This was around the time when we were raising our Series A. And most investors said, this sounds like an excuse that you've not been able to get further up market. And I really believed it, with the idea being that companies that were maybe under 7 years old and above 15 years old were weirdly in the same spot. And that spot was, we're willing to rebuild this from the ground up because we think we found a better way to do it. What we've seen since our Series A, which QED led last year, was that play out, where we now work with, I want to say 6 or 7 public companies, a combined enterprise value well north of $100 billion. And they were all that same profile of really large companies that really had 2 things in common. One, we've been building this for a while, and we've stitched together a bunch of tools. And at this point, it looks like Frankenstein's monster. And 2, we've acquired 6 companies in the past 10 years, and all of them have their own onboarding, which means that despite our size, we actually don't have visibility if we've seen this user before. And Footprint is really built to help with both of those. We will give you a single SDK to redefine onboarding, and we'll also give you that identity network. So if you've seen a user in company product line A and company B that you acquired, product line 2, has them as an applicant, we'll be able to provide that for you in an easy way.
It's amazing at scale. Even if you have unique identifiers, and there's crossover between those unique IDs, whether it's email or phone number, how difficult it is for companies, whether they're going through an acquisition or whether it's just a bank that has multiple different product lines, to have visibility in the fact that it's the same person on the other side.
Yeah, it's humorous to me. I won't out anybody, but I'm always blown away when there are parts of your product where you really hope people are going to maybe not drop their jaw at KYC, but at least say, wow, that's very cool. The one that always gets me is people say, and can I search in the database by identifier? And I go, sure. And they say, can we use our own identifier? And I go, absolutely. We can vault that as a custom object and you can search for it. And they say, can I then search by SSN? And I go, you don't need to. That's already going to circulate if that's across your user base. And that's one that always surprises me, only because the first thing we built at Footprint was searchable vaulting for identifiers. Because the idea was we wanted to build portable identity. My co-founder, Alex, who's very much the brains behind Footprint, he has an amazing background in cryptography, his master's advisor at MIT. He's a Turing Award winner who invented the zero knowledge proof. He started a mobile auth company that was acquired by Akamai. He'll still say that the thing that was the most difficult eng build that he didn't expect in Footprint was that data architecture model and the subtenancy of you have a user vault and then you'll have a sub vault for an enterprise and you'll have sub vaults in that enterprise for their different line items. And you maybe even have a sub vault in that because maybe one of that was a business onboarding and they're beneficial owners. You need to link that vault to another vault. It gets pretty complex when you think about it, especially then if you think that somebody updates their login information, so you need to append the email and the audit trail. Those are all the really complex things when you get to portability, but that becomes really important for these large companies. For a large company, they grow by ARPU and by getting users on products 2 through 4. If you make that 10% easier, that's a huge difference on earnings calls.
You say your co-founder was partly responsible for developing zero knowledge proofs?
No, it's his master's advisor at MIT, Shopee Goldwasser. She was a Turing Award winner for her work on inventing zero knowledge proofs.
That's really interesting. I mean, for people who are watching the podcast who don't have familiarity with zero knowledge proofs, I'm going to hopefully oversimplify this to the point where it's not completely accurate. But the idea is that you can basically prove identity or prove the answer to a question without disclosing the actual data or underlying answer itself. You're not trying to give an answer as much as you're trying to prove that you know the answer. And that's a way to prove identity without necessarily giving over personally identifiable information. ZKPs are really popular in the crypto world where you want to be able to use products without necessarily handing over any identifying information to malicious actors. And when I hear about your long-term vision for Footprint, I really think back to products like Uport or Sovereign or Civic or all these other decentralized IDs. Spring Labs is the one that's a little bit more relevant to our space. That are trying to build these kind of like federated identity networks. And they really started with kind of the grand vision. We want to build one ID for everyone and then distill down into use cases. It feels like Footprint is really kind of growing in the opposite direction, where what began as a point solution for maybe specific instances of KYC or KYB orchestration is evolving into a more scalable identity layer. I'm curious, how you think about and build kind of custom flows to different customer types, because as you're scaling up the different use cases that you have among different customers, there's probably different thresholds for how much identity information they need in order to prove enough to consummate a transaction, and what looks like a reasonable trade-off for them between attrition during the transaction experience versus fidelity of identity. Maybe put differently, if I am selling you a $5 product online, then my potential loss given fraud is probably pretty low, and I just need to be able to prove that you have the relevant zip code and CVV for the credit card that you're trying to use to make the transaction. If I'm trying to sell you a mortgage or have you move in an apartment, like you said, I really want to have more comprehensive identity data about who's on the other side of that transaction. How do you think about customizing flows for this identity network so that you can scale up the use cases over time in a way that really meets the needs of individual customers?
It's very well said. Alex, he did his master's with Shopee doing natural language processing on encrypted patient data. So really taking doctor's notes and figuring out from there, what can we retrieve and what should we retrieve in a HIPAA compliant manner. And we've taken a very similar approach in building Footprint. Is Alex will say ZKPs are great when you don't know you're using ZKPs. Like, you shouldn't need to recognize that. I think he said it well. I once published an investor update on the history of portable identity on the internet, because Footprint definitely was not the first company with the idea, while I'd like to be the last, we're not going to be the last. I think the game theory optimal outcome in this, which I hope for, is that 2 to 3 companies build a proper identity network. Hopefully Footprint's one of them. It won't just be one. It could even be 4. If you look at payment processing, we talk about a duopoly there. There's very rarely monopolies. And I think that's fine. That's good. I digress. When we think about the security here, you say very well in that a lot of the companies that built portable identity in the past built portable identity, and that was the product. But it's not really a product in that one, the desire for privacy, I think we sometimes miss the boat there. I studied data privacy in college. That wasn't my major, but it became my obsession. I was undergrad taking really nerdy law school classes on GDPR back in 2017. And I would go to the computer history archive museums on Friday nights and read reports from the 80s on what did consumers think about data and business models back then, because I was just very fascinated by this. I think today the biggest concern to me is not that my information could be accessed by a company I'm applying for. My big concern is that it could get leaked from that company, or that it's going to end up in the wrong hands from an ATO. So I think that that's the first thing we think about. Then from that, how do you design a platform around that? Well, when you think about companies such as Footprint, I think our vault proxy is a really cool example in our encryption. So Footprint can verify identity. So let's say we're collecting your name, date of birth, address, SSN. We can link your bank account, and we can securely vault a credit card. What's cool in Footprint is if you're using our front end, we can collect that information for you. And then let's say you need to send it to 2 different payment processors and 2 different partner banks. Let's say the 2 different partner banks, one wants to receive a certain JSON where they're going to look at the sub vendors, and the other just wants to see REST signals. And at the payment processors, they have different orders where they want to collect the PAN. Footprint can collect all this information and send it in those 4 different formats without you ever seeing the information. And then you can set up access controls in Footprint where maybe Eli is allowed to change the information that's sent via this vault proxy, and Nick is allowed to change who it goes to. So we're able to build in all of the security by default, where once again, then you could take that a step further, and internally we let you do computation in Footprint. How many users are above 21? Or how many users have gambling in their transaction history? You can start doing this feature engineering where you get these answers that are relevant without them decrypting the PII. And I think that's when we really think about information portability and security and protecting users. And then finally, 25 minutes later, me actually answering your real question, how do we think about then designing those toggles? The portability in SDK is smart. And what I mean by that, company A doesn't need to know what company X collected. Company A needs to tell us what they need access to. And when we see user come back, we will compute the difference of what company A needs and what company X collected, and we'll request anything that new. And then we will only share with company A what the users consented to share with them, regardless of what they shared with company X.
It makes perfect sense. Thinking about this from the consumer perspective, I would love to have one digital wallet that I can use that can both provide my electronic medical records and let me buy a coffee at the coffee shop. And it proactively understands exactly what information it needs to share with different vendors in a way that doesn't necessarily require my active consent every time. Or I can go through kind of a small first-time active consent and then quickly define the rules about when that information can be refreshed, updated, and reshared. It feels like you and your co-founder have both taken an academic approach to founding Footprint, which isn't really a journey I frequently see. There are a lot of founders who are incredible operators and good at just putting something out in the world and refining it. Maybe not as many who've spent time late in the library during undergrad actively researching the problem that they then go on to address. But I noted that you also had Raj Chetty as an econ advisor, which we were catching up on a little bit before we jumped on the recording today. For people who aren't familiar with him, he's one of the youngest ever tenured professors at Harvard. I was just looking up his age, and today's actually his birthday, and he's turning 45. So,
wow, happy birthday, Raj!
Yeah, happy birthday, Raj! I hope he sees this and sees his former protege putting some interesting work on data privacy out into the world in a non-academic context. But I find that really interesting because, his research was on economic mobility and unemployment benefits. When I was an undergrad at Stanford too, I worked a little bit for the Stanford Center for the Study of Poverty and Inequality. And it feels pretty divorced from identity when you think about it broadly. But then you look at systems like Aadhaar in India, which enabled UPI, which is enabling a credit layer built on top of that. And I think when you spend enough time around payments and financial inclusion, you really start to see identity as kind of the base layer, the zero layer for financial inclusion and financial health. This is a very long monologue, but I'm getting to the question, which is, I'm curious how you ended up starting Footprint. It sounds like a long journey where this had been kind of percolating in the background in one format or another for a while.
It chills when you give the introduction because It's far more eloquent than I've ever said. But it's funny, you arrived at a conclusion after hearing me chat for 30 minutes that took me far longer. It's exactly right. I was at Stanford at an interesting time when the school somewhat decided they no longer like tech. From what I've heard, they're past this. It was a brief 4-year hiatus where the 2016 election happened. There were some leaked emails. They just decided tech no longer good for the world. We don't want to be the school of tech. It's apparently they're fully back in. But that was the backdrop. I remember showing up I was a freshman in 2016 and I show up and they pretty much started reading a whole entry about how they no longer wanted this to happen. And I took Raj's class my freshman year and I was blown away by these various studies, whether Arizona could use fourth grade reading scores to predict jail cells they would need in 20 years, to this idea that Google was the best predictor in the world of who would get Parkinson's, the idea of from your reCAPTCHA test and if your finger tremored, to upward mobility. And I got obsessed with this idea of, well, data seems pretty valuable. How do we put people in control of their data? That was my guiding mission in life. That's what I wanted to do. And I would eventually figure out for many years something you figured out much more quickly, which was that identity was the building block to your data. If you could own your identity, you could own your data. And then the next step I took from that is, okay, how do we put people in control of their identity? Kind of the solution was build a pretty unsexy KYC company. Because the only time, when you look at all of those companies we spoke about earlier who tried to build portable identity, they told people, hey, give us your data and then we'll protect it. People don't really want to do that. There's not much of a value prop. LifeLock's an amazing business. There are enough people who will pay to protect their data, but there aren't a lot of people who will conceptually sign up to bootstrap your network effect. And as we spoke about earlier, there aren't a lot of businesses that will sign up to bootstrap your network effect. So essentially, the idea behind Footprint became, if we build a good enough KYC product, which will bootstrap a network effect and build an amazing KYC product, which will then let all of these companies start using Footprint as the premium product in the space, which will then put people in control of their data. That was the crazy idea that we had, and that I wrote the first business plan Feb 3, 2020 in my dorm room. We raised the seed round exactly 2 years later, had our first customer go live 1 year after that, and then we raised our Series A year and 10 days after that. So Feb 3 are very special days in my life. But it was exactly that approach. Alex, I think, is far better founder market fit. He fully studied how do you build security inside consumer products on the internet. He'd been building iPhone apps since 14. And then how do you re-authenticate people from computer to iPhone? And those are the underlying pieces of Footprint which make it happen. And really the why now is FIDO2 or passkeys became an accepted standard Q4 2022. AWS released Nitro Enclaves, which is for vaults in Q4 2020. So that was in the final piece of that infrastructure element.
You know, I think a lot of great products, when I say great products, I mean like really kind of great product archetypes end up with a similar design ethos where you have to be able to parse your end users' revealed and stated preferences. And so Tesla, the Tesla that we know today, is really leading the auto electrification charge in a way that's had an impact on conventional auto manufacturers. And so electric vehicles are a much more plausible future across the board today than they were 15 years ago. But Tesla didn't start by saying, hey, we want to minimize gas consumption globally, so won't you please buy this relatively undifferentiated car that just happens to be electric? The approach that they took was, we're going to build, I think, what got consumer products highest ever rating for a car before, and we're going to build a sport car. We're going to build these vanity cars that people want to own and then go mass market. But the reason that people were buying these cars wasn't necessarily that they cared about the environment, is that they thought it was a really cool car. And you kind of see this in the identity space too, where a lot of privacy-focused startups have launched products that seem relatively undifferentiated, other than the fact that they cache your data more effectively or distribute your data on a blockchain system and don't have a honeypot or really focus on consumer privacy. And even though it's a stated preference, the revealed preference is, I just want the easy product experience. And so that's why you see people who care about their data privacy just clicking accept all on constant GDPR banners or CCPA banners. People don't want to put themselves at risk of getting cancer, but in California, you have a requirement where, you know, every playground that can be made with materials that could possibly be correlated to cancer has to put a placard up there, and nobody ends up reading the placard. You need to find ways to actually kind of hijack people's impulses and their revealed preferences in order to offer them a product that's actually not better for them. And it feels kind of like that's what Footprint is getting to, is I just want to be able to remove the sticky piece of friction in allowing a transaction to happen between two parties that don't necessarily know each other. But over time, that can evolve into something much further.
It's well said. And I think it's for both sides of that marketplace. We need to solve the problem of removing that friction for companies onboarding them in a compliant manner. If we remove friction, but we are a black box and it's very unclear the traceability, we're not getting closer to portability. And even worse, you can create one-click fraud, which nobody wants. So I think it's very well said. What do people actually care about? That's users who are applying for different products. And then what do the PMs care about when they're implementing these systems? People normally expect, to your point, to give up some information if they want a home mortgage. The nice thing is that if we get that and we have this strong fidelity, we don't need to give that information when you're then linking your bank account to deposit money for a mobile game. But we have this increased fidelity that it's you, not somebody impersonating you. And I think that's important because especially when you think about who, if you break down the 30 billion of identity theft, it's often the elderly. It's often people who are less tech forward. It's often more vulnerable people. And that's the thing that really, really bothers me. It's often people who aren't even aware that this could happen. And I think that's why the systems here should kind of be like that sign in the playground. You should be protected without having to go and sign up to be protected.
Yeah, the writer, I'm sure you read as well, Patrick McKenzie, has a good tagline about fraud and risk in systems, that the optimal amount of fraud in a system is not zero. If your fraud levels are zero, it means you are probably turning away valid customers. So how do you work with your own users to think about the trade-off between increasing conversions and minimizing fraud to a level that's acceptable for their business?
I think that's right. Our head of fraud built a lot of the early identity systems at Stripe. He likes to say, if you want no fraud, we'll block everybody. And if you want to remove all friction, we'll let everybody on. To your point, it's not that binary. I think first party fraud is impossible to solve fully, which is if you onboard Eli and Eli genuinely is Eli and Eli commits fraud, there were maybe off things you could have seen of suspicious activity, but I genuinely think that that is inevitable. And the repercussion of that, though, should be that there's essentially Eli shouldn't be banned from the internet. There should probably be context if Eli opens an account on a similar application that, hey, you may want to reduce the amount of credit available to Eli at the beginning until he earns it. So that's the other thing. We don't want some Black Mirror society where we do a chargeback that a company disagrees with and they're able to ban you from the entire internet. That's definitely not what you want to have happen. For us, we think that conversion and fraud are somewhat independent entities. Like I don't like the idea of thinking if we add a driver's license scam, we'll catch this much fraud, but we'll reduce conversion by X. Instead, I like thinking, how do we build our doc scan to reduce conversion maximally? And I think we've done that. Our doc scan today now has industry leading conversion. 92% of people who start it finish it. Industry average is about 75%. That's because we're the only company using app clips, which was a big innovation Footprint brought to market. We're tapping into Apple SDKs and rectangular detection and facial detection. So for us, it's instead of saying this is going to be a trade-off, it's how do we get, and I want 92 to get to 99. How do we make our doc scan so good that everybody who starts it finishes it? Then on the fraud side, we think about how can we constantly be adding more controls that can be run invisibly? Synthetic fraud is a good example. We can run motor vehicle checks. We can look at your typing patterns. So there are a lot of things that we can then do in the background, which can increase fraud detection in buckets. Once again, fraud can't really be just a number. There's a gamification of fraud that we try to not participate in. You most typically see this in companies love toggles where they give you a risk score, 70, and you set the bar. And if somebody get in who is a 74, and then you try to adjust the toggle, we don't really believe in that. We think about there are certain controls that we can put in place. We have a pretty good idea of what bucket of fraud that will get. And that should be an independent thing. We will then try to maximize conversion and the things that should lead to good conversion, such as if you collect that license, and we'll simulate what the name should be to make sure that matches in a bureau.
Pivoting a little bit here, because you had shared this before, I was reading through some of your investor updates, which I know it's been a little while since you put them out. Investor updates are always kind of a pain because really what you're trying to do is take a lot of point experiences and crystallize them and pull out overarching messages, which is just really difficult to do when you're trying to build the plane while you're flying it at the same time. But I did really like your investor updates because, one, you really talked about the world outside of just you and the company and what you were building, talking about Avicii's creative process or your relationship with your granddad or losing your dog, which is something that, we went through not too long ago, and how those experiences or examples informed your own thinking and decision making. It's a level of openness that I don't see a lot from founders, because I think founders are kind of pressured to be salespeople first and to make it look as though everything is always going very well and things are up and to the right. But when you peel back the hood at a startup, that's almost never the case. And so there's a huge delta between perception and reality for building early stage products. Why did you start writing the investor updates to start with? And were you scared to put yourself out there like that? And do you see yourself picking them back up at some point?
It's a great question that I got asked a lot by investors who said, why did you just send me your rambling thoughts on the shadow self? So our investor updates now look like a bit more classic investor updates. And I'm going to start a Substack in the fall where I publish even more unfiltered philosophical thoughts on the world. I say when we interview people, they ask, what do we look for in Footprint? I normally say three things: drive, intellectual curiosity, and empathy. And empathy is one people always find a bit surprising. My grandma was the most empathetic human I ever met. And she passed from cancer after about 9.5 years. It was a 6-month expected life. They put up a plaque for her in the chemo ward. They loved her. And to me, there is always a superpower, and I think being genuine. So I like to say, I say this in the honest admission that I try to be very honest, because I also think there are tactical advantages. And I think more people should be more honest, because you can only have real conversations with people. But a lot of the motivation behind writing these was to your exact point. I think that we glorify a lot in tech, and we have these hype cycles around all of the good things that are happening. That's great. I am a huge fan of giving nerds the attention that they deserve in the world. I think what gets lost is this human element where people are building the future of tomorrow and don't know the future of themselves. And it's something I definitely experienced, where I think you start companies having these big dreams about how the companies will help you unlock these things in the world. And that's a very bad way to think about company building. It's bad in that, one, you're not going to build the best company if you're building the company for what I'd call less pure reasons, which, for the record, I think most, especially younger founders, start companies for. And it's not the best for your employees, your investors, for your customers, all of these people. I think I started putting them out because I didn't see as much of that conversation. And what I always find inspiring was the amount of founders who I'd have reach out to me, and not just founders, people in tech, ambitious people, who would say, I read this, and for the first time, I called my best friend and spoke to him about what I thought happiness meant. Or I called my board and I spoke to them about issues that we were having. And I think those are the conversations that I really wanted to start, and I still hope to start. I meet so many young people who say, my goal in life is to start a company. And I say, that's not really a goal. If you come to me and you say, I want to be rich, we can talk about ways that you can maybe get rich. I probably wouldn't recommend being the 192nd KYC company. If you come to me and say, I want to be my own boss, we can talk about ways you can do that. If you come to me and say, I believe deeply in vertical SaaS for dermatologists, I'll say that you should probably build that. It seems like you really care about that. So I just think that there is a lot of nuance there, and I care a lot about, it sounds very cliched, we do only have one time to live. And once we start things, they're big commitments, and you should make sure you're doing things that genuinely really excite you. So I think that was the motivation, to not get overly philosophical.
Well, I really do hope you start the Substack. I think the level of openness in the investor updates that you put together is more related to the company that you're building than one might imagine. You put it well just now. You said being genuine is a real superpower. At the same time, Footprint's superpower seems to be identifying genuine identities. And so you're really kind of walking the walk when it comes to putting your full self out there and exposing, who's actually on the other end of this company, whether you're talking to an investor or a customer or just Gen Pop on the internet. I tend to agree with you. I think being genuine is something that's underemphasized these days, but increasingly important in a world where people are competing for share of voice, and where, founders especially feel the pressure to kind of shout about how great things are all the time. So I hope you'll continue to take that ethos with you, both into your investor updates and to everything that you're doing at Footprint. I appreciate you finding time to talk.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.